Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, November 13th, 2025. And today we have a special guest, Professor Yakov Rabkin, who's a professor of history at the University of Montreal since 1973. And he's a founding member of Independent Jewish Voice. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you on, Yakov. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And let me start with your book, and it was published in September 2025, if I'm not mistaken. It's about, let me bring it up to our audience. The book is about Israel in Palestine and Jewish rejection of Zionism. And I think you can buy it online, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yes, yes.
yeah, it's available on Amazon and all these, websites that i- the issue, I think, when we talk about Judaism and Zionism, many people, many of us don't know what is the difference between the two terms. And when it comes to the basics, to the main difference between the two, what could you bring to the table that may help us to understand the two sort of ideology movement? Jewish movement is a religion, is an ancient religion, but Zionism, to my understanding, is something new. But you're taking that.
Well, you're absolutely right. Judaism is a religion, a confession that has been around for thousands of years, uh, and it's a universal in the sense that anyone can convert and become Jew if one wants to follow Judaism. Um, Zionism is a political movement based on the idea of gathering Jews in Palestine. And the idea originated among English speaking Christians, Protestants, in the 17th century. And it attracted very important people, including Isaac Newton. The Zionist idea was developing among Protestants, English speaking Protestants, till about the end of the 19th century, when Jews, some Jews to be more exact, those who were very much estranged from Judaism, who knew very little about it, they accepted this idea and had the first Zionist Congress, the first political Congress of Zionism, in 1897. So it's about 130 years ago. It's quite telling that the first Congress was held in Basel, Switzerland, which doesn't have a big Jewish community and definitely didn't have a big one then. The reason was that originally the Zionists wanted to have their Congress in Munich, which had a big Jewish community. But German Jews addressed the German government with a request to forbid the holding of the Zionist Congress. They were so much against it that the Congress had to be moved to Switzerland. And we can talk later about why Jews objected and rejected Zionism.
Seems, yeah. When you look at Israel today, and because whatever they say in Netanyahu and his administration, it's all about whoever is in favor of Judaism, in favor of a state called Israel that is the state of Jewish people. Can we wrap up all the Jewish people in Israel and the way that, because the way they're describing that, if you are not thinking the way that the government in Israel think, that you're against Jews. It doesn't matter you are Christian, Jew, and whatever. We have Christian Zionists. I would say they're mostly supporting this sort of idea. What is the agenda? Why do they need to push these people in the Middle East in that direction? Because
Well,
after all, I don't see what's going on with Israel would help Israel in a long run.
well, you're absolutely right. There are tens of millions of Christian Zionists, and there are about 14 million Jews altogether, including babies and old people. So the idea of gathering Jews in Palestine, in the state of Israel today, is largely promoted by Christian Zionists. Now, why is it important for Christian Zionists in particular? Because as in the 17th century, just as today, they believe that by gathering Jews in the Holy Land, they're going to speed the second coming of Jesus Christ, the second coming of Messiah. And this motivates them to defend the state of Israel, right or wrong. And a good example of that is the American ambassador in Israel, who is a Baptist pastor and who considers that he is an emissary of God, not an emissary of President Trump only. And they take it very seriously. Of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I think that not only him, want to say that if you're a real Jew, you have to support Israel. And this is shared by many people, including President Trump. President Trump, in one of meetings with Jews, actually said that, you have to be good Jews. You have to support Israel. For him, it's what Jews are about. He is not a Christian Zionist. I mean, he is barely Christian. But what matters is that this idea has tremendous support among Christian Zionists. But as we speak now, there is some disappointment, and some prominent conservative Christian Zionists are leaving the fold and become critics of Israel. So that support is becoming more fragile than before.
Looking at the history, in your opinion, does the historical record show that Zionist leaders anticipated or even planned the displacement of Palestinians from the start?
I think the idea of displacing the Palestinians is an old one. It can be traced back to the formula, which was utterly incorrect, but very popular. A land without people for people without land. Well, land without people means precisely that. And we could see that the British, who supported the Zionist idea in 1917 and 1920s, wrote very openly that we are not concerned about the opinions of a few 100,000 Arabs who happen to live there. The expression was happen to live there, as if they really don't belong, and the land should belong to the Jews. And that's a very Christian Zionist attitude, which incidentally, Prime Minister Netanyahu mobilized very successfully. When he was Israeli representative at the United Nations, he spent a lot of time in southern United States, precisely with Christian Zionists, trying to build up support for Israel, and he was largely successful.
I think comparing the two, Zionism and Judaism, what is the reality when it comes to the relationship between the two, and what's the myth in today's world that we may not be aware of that?
Well, one, as I said, one is religion. The other one is a political movement. So when the Israeli government and Zionist circles accuse those who criticize Israel of anti-Semitism, it's utterly incorrect, because anti-Semitism is about rejecting Jews as Jews, just because they're Jews. Whereas opposition to Zionism is political opposition to a certain idea. And the two have to be distinguished. You know, I live in Montreal, where the idea of political independence of Quebec is very much debated, and we had 2 referenda on the subject. And there are Quebecers who reject independence, and there are those who approve it and vote for it. But they, both of them, remain Quebecers. It's not an issue of being against Quebecers. It's a political choice, as we all have. And I think that by confusing Judaism with Zionism, the Israeli government tries to stifle criticism, particularly criticism of the last 2 years, when Israel was engaged in an unprecedented way in violence in Gaza.
You mentioned the last, since October the 7th, nobody can argue that what has happened in Gaza and in any sense, in any aspect, has helped Israel and the position of even Netanyahu and his administration. But even in the United States, you see the changes that are happening. The people are talking about what is the meaning of this sort of relationship between the United States and Israel. And do you think that in today's Israel, and the way that, you see the polls coming out supporting Netanyahu and his administration, how this sort of support comes to the administration, and how did they manage that? Because you have to have a great campaign of, to convince the people what you're doing is right for your future. How did they manage that? How they did convince the people who are living in Israel? They know many of them, went out of Israel during the conflict between Iran and Israel, between the situation in Gaza, and many secular Jews, they went to Cyprus. But after all, you see those people who remained in Israel, they were still supporting Netanyahu. How did it happen? How they can manage that to get this support from the people in Israel?
Well, I think that the majority of Israelis supported the army in its activities in Gaza. The protests that took place were really about freeing the hostages, or freeing the prisoners, to be more exact. Why did Israelis, and why do Israelis support this kind of military campaign against civilian population, essentially? Well, it has to do with the education they received. And there's a very powerful message in that education, which taps into Jewish history. When the Hamas attack occurred in October 23, it was called an unprovoked pogrom. Now, pogrom is a violent attack on Jews for no reason except that they're Jews. For a nuclear power to say that they're innocent Jews and that was unprovoked is preposterous. But many people in Israel actually felt that we didn't do anything wrong, and all of a sudden they attack us. They forget about decades of oppression of the Palestinians. of expulsion of the Palestinians, many of whom ended up in Gaza, because many people in Gaza had been expelled, or their parents had been expelled from what is today Israel. And in fact, early Zionist leaders knew that and even articulated this. Moshe Dayan, a very important general in the history of Israel, said at a funeral of a soldier killed near Gaza, precisely in those areas that were attacked in 2023, he said, we have to understand these people who sit in Gaza and watch how we occupy their homes and we till their land. We have to understand that these people are very angry. He didn't justify it, he explained it. This kind of explanation was absent in 2023, and Netanyahu and his government really whipped up the campaign of innocents attacked by evil people. And there were, of course, a lot of lies about babies being burnt in microwaves and so on, and mass rape. It has all been debunked. But you asked me why they supported, because they really believed that they had not done anything wrong. And all of a sudden, this attack. So it's a very powerful feeling. In Israel, there's a lot of denial of the harm done to the Palestinians.
Sorry. Your book argues that the Zionism was a radical departure from mainstream Judaism. What aspects of traditional Jewish identity did Zionists intentionally reject or rewrite?
Well, Judaism defined Jews for thousands of years. What did Judaism require of Jews? Just as Islam, which is in a way a branch of Judaism that had branched out at a certain point, to observe commandments, to follow divine will. So Judaism is about following the commandments and trying to live a proper life as defined in Jewish sources. It was a religious identity. Zionism wanted to transform this religious identity into a national identity, pretty much modeled on Eastern and Central Europe of the late 19th century. In Eastern and Central Europe, till today, as a matter of fact, ethnic nationalism was very important and still is. Ethnic nationalism was around those who were accepting the Zionist idea, because we have to understand that the founders of Zionism were from Central Europe, so the Herzl and his friends, but the Zionist settlers who went to Palestine at the turn of the 20th century went there from the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire had many minorities, Ukrainians, Poles, Lithuanians, many of whom had a national identity and fought for their independence from the empire. Jews modeled their identity, the Zionist Jews, according to this model. Now, why did they do so? Because from those Jews who accepted Zionism in the Russian Empire, there was really very little choice. The Russian Empire didn't allow Jews to move to big cities, except a few exceptions, like very wealthy merchants and doctors and so on. So these Jews no longer observed commandments. They no longer were religious Jews, but they couldn't move anywhere from the Pale of Settlement, which is the area of today's Baltic republics, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova. So that's where they lived. And if a French Jew lost interest in Judaism and decided to drop everything, he could move to Paris, he could change his name and become a Frenchman, marry a Catholic, and disappear as a Jew. Russian Jews didn't have this choice. They were stuck in the Pale of Settlement, and they reconceptualized their identity as a national identity, like Ukrainians and Poles and so on. So this is what Zionist identity, or the new Jewish identity, they didn't even call it Jew, they call it Hebrew to distinguish it from Jews. Now they use interchangeably, but in the 20s and 30s, the new Zionist identity was Hebrew identity. And they talked about Tel Aviv as a Hebrew city, as distinguished from Jews, because they wanted to emphasize that the new Hebrew, which they wanted to be strong, muscular, brave, intrepid, the very opposite of the traditional Jew as they painted it. I think there is a quote in my book of Jabotinsky, one of the founders of Zionism. He wrote the article in the very beginning of the 20th century. And there he says that we want a new Hebrew, which would be the very opposite of a Jew, for him it was very clear that their model of a new Hebrew was the opposite of a traditional Jew that they painted as weak, compromising, and so on. You could say that Zionism has a tremendous amount of self-hate. You want to change your people, you want to change yourself into something else because you you hate what you are. You want to become something else. And I think this is a very important dimension of Zionism. They fought very strongly against their native language, Yiddish, because in the Pale of Settlement, most of them spoke Yiddish. In Zionist circles, they spoke modern Hebrew. And there was tremendous fight against Yiddish. Now it's over. Hebrew has won. And Yiddish can be taught at the universities as a sort of kind of a dead language. But it's not dead, of course. Yiddish is spoken by religious Jews around the world. In Montreal, for example, there are maybe 30,000 Hasidic Jews who speak Yiddish in everyday life. And in Israel as well, and in the United States. So the old Jewish identity exists. And this is why in Israel there's such a rejection, such a disdain for these traditional Jews who are dressed in black and white. And on top of everything else, as you know, they reject they reject military service. They don't want to go to the army. So for many Israelis, and this I can understand, this is unacceptable. You know, they live in the country, they receive benefits from the state of Israel, child benefits and others, and they don't want to serve in the army. So for many Israelis, it's not very clear. When my other book on Jewish opposition to Zionism was published in Hebrew in Israel, my publisher called me when I arrived for a book launch. Says, "Did you organize this?" I said, "What?" See, open the television. So I opened the television. There was a huge demonstration against military service by these black and white dressed Jews. And of course, Israeli journalists asked me later, why don't they want to go to the army? Why? they couldn't understand that rejecting military service has to do with rejection of Zionism, because these people don't want to be part of the secular Israeli society. And till today, it's a very problematic issue in Israel. A tiny minority of these, what they call ultra-Orthodox Jews, agreed to serve in the army. The vast majority say we prefer to go to jail rather than to the army.
I believe they're not the only faction that they're under the pressure from the Zionists, but there are other, you know, eh, other parts of the society, Jewish societies, that are feeling the pressure coming from the Zionists. What type of pressure, censorship, or social punishment have Jewish anti-Zionists historically faced within their own communities?
Well, we have to go back to the early 1920s. Zionists, like many revolutionary movements at the time, pretended that they are the vanguard of the Jewish people. Like the Bolsheviks pretended they were the vanguard of the working class. So Zionists, very similarly, pretended that they are the vanguard of the Jewish people. And therefore, whoever was against them was against the Jewish people, not against the minority, but against what they represented in their mind, Jewish people. And there was a first act of political terrorism in Palestine when an anti-Zionist Jew was assassinated on the orders of a Zionist military organization, Haganah, in 1924. Why was he assassinated? Because he was helping the ultra-Orthodox rabbis to organize a delegation to London, and that was then the mandatory power in Palestine, in order to convince British authorities that the Zionists don't represent the Jews. This was unacceptable for the Zionists. And as we know today, because many people admitted and were proud of assassinating this man, Yakov, they wanted to get rid of him. And we should remember that political terror came to Palestine with these Zionist settlers in the early 20th century, many of whom had taken part in the Russian revolutionary movement, in underground assassinations of imperial authorities and so on. So these people took this experience with them to Palestine. And of course, that's an extreme case of assassination. Today, we have simply banning anti-Zionist discourse. Actually, in Israel, it may be even freer than in the United States. Sometimes it happens like that. I would say that if my book is any on Jewish opposition to Zionism, which was published in Hebrew, it was received in Israel with a lot more press coverage and media coverage than it was in the United States. Because in the United States, many people till today are very wary of explaining that there are Jews who are anti-Zionist. I think today, particularly after the electoral victory of Zohran Mamdani in New York, it's quite clear that he was supported by 1/3 of the Jews in New York, while he is an open critic of Israel.
More than 1/3 of the Jews.
Well, we don't know exactly, but
yeah, it's 36%.
36. Okay,
Yeah.
1/3,
Yeah.
more, slightly more.
Yeah.
You're an engineer, so you're more precise than I am. But what is really important is that these Jews are good Jews. They may or may not be religious. Actually, one of the most populous Hasidic dynasties, Satmar, who are very anti-Zionist, came out in support of Mamdani 2 days before the election. I think that changed many people in the United States who became aware that there's strong Jewish opposition to Zionism, whereas before they considered that these people are not good Jews, they're somehow not real Jews. Well, today it's very difficult to say so.
You know, when it comes to Israel and the concept of Israel, it seems that, as you know, the book of the former president of Iran, former president of the United States, and Carter, he was talking about the apartheid. You know, looking at even, you know, the one of the worst enemies, as Netanyahu considers of Israel, is Iran. Whenever he talks, Iran is the main enemy in the Middle East. Looking at Iran today, you see Jewish people for many years, in the part of Iranian culture, actually, Christians, Muslims, Zoroastrians, all together. But they want to create, even considering, you know, the structure of the Middle East, you have to consider all these people from different religions. They have been living together for such a long time, and you come in with the concept of a state based on a religion, that would not work. And I don't know what is the concept and how can they achieve that. Is there any possibility, in your opinion, in achieving that without creating an apartheid state, as they have been trying to do for such a long time, and, you know, since 1948, and
Well, since
it,
before, well before that.
well before that? And what do they want to achieve, or is it possible to achieve the objectives they have in their mind?
No, you're right that in Iran, actually, I visited Iran in 2016. And being an observant Jew, I went to synagogues and I met Jews and we celebrated the holiday together. I wrote even a little travelogue. You can find it in the internet. It's one of the few countries where you don't have policemen in front of the synagogue because they're not afraid. No one attacks them because they're Jews. And I was there during the New Year, the Persian New Year. And we went to the synagogue with people whom I met, the Jewish people. And it was very moving how they greeted each other as they were going to the synagogue. In one breath, they would say, Shabbat Shalom, Nowruz Mubarak. Just naturally. And that's exactly what you said, that they lived there for thousands of years, maybe 3,000 of them, 2,500 years. And they're Iranians for all purposes. But they are of Jewish confession, just as they're Muslim confession and Zoroastrian and so on. Now, going back to your question about this idea of separate state, apartheid. Well, again, in Eastern Europe, you could see it till today. The idea of having a state for one ethnic group with the exclusion of others is very much alive. The conflict in Ukraine is a good example of that. The fate of Russian speakers in the Baltic republics, many of whom are not citizens and they kind of in a gray zone. So the idea of having a state for one ethnic group only doesn't work very well in Eastern Europe. It has caused a lot of violence, and it certainly doesn't work outside of Europe, where populations are very mixed, and they were always very mixed. the idea of separating them and creating a state for the Jews was present from the very beginning of Zionist settlement. They wanted, there was a concept of Hebrew labor. Again, they wouldn't say Jewish, they would say Hebrew labor, that you have to hire Hebrews to your work, to do work, which means that you discriminate against local population. And they called that system afrada meaning separation. It so happens that the word afrada and apartheid sound almost identical. But the idea was there since the early 20s. In 2018, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, even accepted a law that says that Israel is a state of the Jewish people, whether they live in Israel or they don't live in Israel. And others are citizens, but they don't have collective rights in the state of Israel. That law didn't create any new reality. The reality had been there for a long time, but it made it official. So it's a very dangerous, extremely explosive idea of separating people and creating states out of one ethnic group. It may work in Iceland, where you don't have practically any, even there you already have minorities now. But it certainly doesn't work in Lebanon and generally in West Asia. I think everywhere people are mixed. Of course, the fact that they're mixed doesn't mean that they love each other or they always live peacefully. Sometimes they don't. But creating a separate state and expelling others obviously is a recipe for violence that doesn't stop. And Israel has experienced violence because it generated violence.
Yeah. You mentioned the West Asia. I think the West Asia is the origin of all the prophets. That's why you see all these, I would say, brothers and sisters are fighting each other and nobody knows what is the meaning of that. But geopolitically, when you see the support coming from the United States to Israel in order to help these radical Zionists, what is the nature, as a Jewish scholar, as someone who studies what's going on with the state of Israel, how do you evaluate the relationship between the United States and Israel today?
Well, the United States and Israel are very much connected. As Professor Mersheimer once put it there, he likes to repeat that sentence, they're joined at the hip. Israel is and has been an outpost of European civilization in West Asia. The founding book of Zionism by Theodor Herzl says it very clearly, that it will be a barrier against Asian barbarism and so on. It's a normal colonial discourse of early 20th century, the end of 19th century. You have to remember that colonial wasn't a bad word. The European powers practiced colonialism around the world. And the Jews, the Zionists, joined the company in a way. And they saw nothing wrong about colonizing another country. So the idea of having a separate state wasn't anything that was particularly new. And that state was to be first an outpost of British influence when Britain was a great power, and then the United States became the great power after the Second World War. So Israel became very much attached to the United States, not right away, incidentally. The real change came, I think, in the 1970s, particularly during the October War in 1973, when American supplies really saved Israel from defeat in the war. And that dependence on the United States continued, in fact, till today. You saw that US forces, with the help of British, French, Jordanian, Egyptian, Saudi, were shooting down Iranian missiles directed at Israel. So Israel is supported by a very important coalition around the United States. And within the United States, you have a constituency of Christian Zionists, many of whom support Israel more than they support the United States. In the United States, this group is called Israel Firsters, and that's an expression that appeared in late 20th century. For them, Israel is the first. And I think there are several members of the Senate who said, if you're against Israel, you're against God. I don't know any political movement where this kind of enthusiasm is actually spelled out. So in the United States, support is coming from the Zionist lobby, which is Christian and Jewish. And also, you have to understand that Israel has become a very important source of surveillance and military technology. And in today's world, where the polarization between the wealthy and the poor is becoming more and more acute, the ruling classes need this know-how and technology in order to control the population, in order to survey the population and prevent revolution or violent events. So Israel, in that sense, is also very useful, not only as an outpost in West Asia, but also as a source of all these technologies, which are very good because they've been tested on the Palestinians for several decades. In that sense, Israel does to the Palestinians what many right-wing Americans, French, and British want to do to their own immigrants. That's where the right-wing parties and movements in Europe and the United States are very much pro-Israel. It doesn't mean that they're pro-Jewish necessarily, because many of them have anti-Semitic past, but they are very much pro-Israel. And again, there's nothing new about it, because Theodor Herzl wrote in his diary, anti-Semites will be our best allies. And he was right, because the anti-Semites wanted to get rid of the Jews in Europe, and the Zionists wanted to take those Jews to Palestine. So there was a confluence of interest. I hope this long answer answers your question.
Yeah, but I think that could help to understand, because you've mentioned the Zionist movement has started in the United Kingdom. But recently we've heard the leader of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, Kemi Badenoch, saying that what Israel is doing is they're doing our job in the Middle East. What Ukraine is doing, that they're doing. What is that? What is that agenda, in your opinion, that they want to sacrifice these people because they want to achieve something? What is that objective, in your opinion?
Well, it's not only the British. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said during the Israeli attack on Iran in June this year that Israel is doing dirty work for us. And you can wonder, what does Germany have against Iran? Why they are so happy that it's done against Iran? I think that there is a growing racism in Europe, and the United States. And we should remember that racism characterized European civilization for centuries. It's only since 1960s that racism became a bad word. Look, in 1963, it took a U.S. paratrooper division to accompany a girl to a school in the United States because the school was desegregated. And during the Second World War, U.S. Army was segregated. After the Second World War, there were brutal colonial campaigns waged by France in Algeria and Britain in Kenya. They killed thousands and thousands of people. So racism is raising again. It becomes again more acceptable. And I would say even fascism becomes more acceptable. You know, in Canada, there was a very telling episode when President Zelensky of Ukraine came for a visit, and he was received in the parliament. And then the Speaker of the Parliament said, "And I would like to greet someone who is a veteran of the Second World War, who bravely fought against the Russians." Now, anyone who knows anything about history immediately would understand where you could fight against the Russians during the Second World War. Apparently, the speaker didn't know, and Zelensky didn't say anything. Of course, it transpired right away. He was a former SS member, and the entire Canadian Parliament was applauding. Now, why did this happen? Who put them up there in Parliament? There were strong forces in Canada who want to rehabilitate fascists, say, well, they are acceptable. They were doing the right thing. They were fighting the Russians. So the idea of fighting an external enemy is very attractive. You mentioned Britain. Britain in particular, throughout the history, preferred to fight wars by someone else. Now, you remember even the Second World War, and they landed in France, but they didn't do very much. And they had to run away in what today was made by cinema as a heroic act. In fact, they were saving their lives in Dunkirk when they were abandoning France. So the idea of fighting by proxy is very much in the tradition. So Israel openly says, we are defending European and Western interests. And Ukrainian ruling class also says, help us to fight the Russians, because otherwise you'll have to fight the Russians on your territory. So the idea of proxy wars is not new. Today it has acquired a very bloody character, particularly in Ukraine, because Ukraine is really bleeding from this terrible war. And according to military experts, which I am not, there's no chance it can win. They're ready to fight till the last Ukrainian, but again, Ukraine doesn't gain very much from it. The Ukrainian ruling class may, but not regular Ukrainians. So in fact, here we're touching on something very important, which is common in European politics today. 87% of Ukrainians want negotiations with Russia, but the government doesn't. They are ready to fight. And this democratic deficit you could find elsewhere in the Western world. Macron has the 11% approval rating. Starmer is slightly better, but not much. And they're trying to fight a war. Macron in particular, he's ready to send troops to Ukraine. He is trying to build up military budgets, cutting social budgets. This is happening in many Western countries, including Canada, incidentally. But it has no democratic support. The population doesn't support this. Well, this is the reality of today's Western world, and these proxy wars is an expression of that.
Yeah. When it comes to Israel, do you feel that Netanyahu, how do you see the role of Netanyahu and the Likud party in forming, the long-term strategy of Israel? Because there has to be something called long-term strategy. How do you consider their role in that?
Well, the only material I can base my judgment upon is what they say. I have no way of knowing what they think. And some members of the Netanyahu government are very open. They want to have Israel free of Palestinians. They want to do total ethnic cleansing, both on the West Bank and in Gaza, and to have a greater Israel beyond the current borders. Israel is a state without borders. It's very interesting. No Israeli government, no Zionist movement before the state ever said what kind of borders they want. They always referred to defensible borders, but what exactly are defensible borders? And in a situation of settler colonialism, where you have one border and then that border is attacked by someone, so you want to extend your border further and further and further, that's the history of Israel. So I think for quite a few people in the Netanyahu government, a greater Israel free of Palestinians, that's their strategic goal. Netanyahu himself, I think, doesn't have a strategy, and we could see that during the war in Gaza. Some people say, I'm not sure about it, but some people say that his motivation was to save himself from prison and from legal problems. I don't know. I cannot judge. But it was quite clear that he didn't have a military strategy or a political strategy, for that matter. So I think that Israel faces a situation of crisis. And this crisis is both internal and external, but particularly internal. Because even though most Israelis supported the army in Gaza, they did not necessarily support Netanyahu. There were quite a few people against him. And as you mentioned in the beginning, there has been quite a bit of emigration from Israel. And people who emigrate from Israel are usually the younger, more educated, more advanced in their work. So that doesn't hold a very good promise for the country. But the help of Zionist circles in the United States, particularly, is crucial in that sense. There are billions of dollars being sent to Israel, and that enables it to function pretty normally. Life of Israelis has been normal during those 2 years, except when there was a war with Iran. Then they felt, or some of them felt, what the war is about. But by and large, Israeli society continues to live for many years as if nothing happens next door. And that is largely thanks to the financial help that comes from Zionist circles and the US government quite regularly. So what is the strategy? To continue living as a separate Jewish state, as they call it. I think that Israel managed to win all the wars. It has never won a peace because it didn't have a strategy for peace.
Is Netanyahu planning? I don't know. Before you mentioned one of the reasons that many people would argue is that Netanyahu wants to stay in power. That's why he continues with these sort of conflicts, new conflicts. But after all, before leaving, his position in Israel, do you think he's gonna do something? Uh, because he wants to stay in the history book of Israel. He wants to be there as one of the most influential and important characters in Israel. What would he do, in your opinion? Because it seems to me that he's going to attack again Iran, but the outcome would not benefit him, would not help Israel. What is that? How big is he going to do that to bring the United States into the conflict, which is not possible from what we've seen so far from the Trump administration?
Well, I have no insight about what Netanyahu thinks.
Yeah.
I have no idea what he thinks. I repeat what I hear, and people say there is a probable attack on Iran, another attack on Iran. Well, I don't know how that's going to turn out for Israel, but Netanyahu has already entered history. He is the longest serving prime minister. Under his leadership, Israel has changed quite significantly. Under his leadership, many members of his government openly say that they're fascists, just openly, without. So this is something new and something significant. I think his place in history is guaranteed, I would say. Like, place of Mussolini is guaranteed as well. So people who are remembered in history are not necessarily nice people. And Netanyahu may be one of them. As to military prospects with the war in Iran, I said I'm not a military expert. I cannot say. What I hear is that Iran is prepared for that, but there's no way for me to judge it.
Yeah. Just before wrapping up, if your book is about the Jewish rejection of Zionism. If you were, to mention the main topic, the main objective of your book, what is that could help me and our audience, those people who are watching us, to understand the main goal of your book?
It's a very short book. And it's very accessible in terms of information that it contains. It helps people understand and find answers to the questions you asked in the beginning of our program. Namely, what's the difference between Judaism and Zionism? When Zionism appeared? What is Zionism and what is Judaism? All these questions are explained, in my opinion, quite clearly in the book. And particularly, the book enables you to see where Zionism comes from, where this genocide in Gaza comes from in terms of ideas, in terms of logic of colonial settlement, where you have to get rid of local population. And this idea had been spelt for decades, practically from the beginning of the Zionist movement. The slogan of a land without people for a people without land is a very sinister slogan. They're trying to make it a land without people. So far, they haven't succeeded, but they've expelled hundreds of thousands of people, and they killed a lot of people. So it's a very violent project that my book explains that it didn't happen out of thin air. It explains the roots of that movement and those who abetted and helped this movement to grow, namely Britain when it was a great power, and then the United States with the great power. So I suppose that the book will open the eyes of many people.
Yeah,
At least
I'm sure.
that's what my readers write to me.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure that would that could. I start reading your book, by the way, but it takes time to read it all. Because but I'm so happy to have your book and reading it, and I think it's a great pleasure. It was a great pleasure to have you on this podcast because we need to talk to each other. People all around the world, we need to talk each other in going against colonialism, racism, fascism. These are the main enemies of human being, in my opinion. And you're
I
doing a great job in that direction.
And I'm grateful that you created this opportunity to explain certain things. And I hope that it's not the last time we see each other.
No, no, we're gonna talk to you again and again. Thank you so much, Yakov.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Have a great time there. Bye bye.